Everyone. So we are on chapter 13, which is primarily focused on the law of the air and issues of jurisdiction over airspace and outer space. Right off the cuff, I just want to emphasize the the general notion that states in general have absolute and unlimited sovereignty over their national airspace. Well, of course, there is no international agreement on the vertical extent of sovereign airspace, but generally speaking, 100 kilometers, which is about 62 miles, is a working benchmark for the boundary between airspace and outer space. So up to 100 kilometers is considered, up to 100 kilometers from the surface is considered airspace, and beyond that is, generally speaking, considered outer space. Now in this chapter we're going to go through a bunch of conventions and arrangements that regulate the issues of jurisdiction over first airspace and then later in the chapter outer space. The Paris Convention of 1919 is probably the first international legal arrangement that deals with the question of jurisdiction over airspace. According to the Paris Convention, absolute sovereignty of the state over its airspace, which is defined as the space overlying landmass and the territorial sea, is recognized. Also remember that generally speaking, the Paris Convention contains a right of innocent passage for private aircraft over airspace subject to certain conditions. Then you have the Chicago Convention of 1944, one of the landmark agreements on governing airspace, which establishes the International Civil Aviation Organization known as ICAO. And ICAO, generally speaking, its most important contribution is establishing the so-called five freedoms of the air. And these are, as you can see on the slide, the freedom, the privilege of flying over the territory of another state without landing. Number two, the privilege of landing in another state for technical reasons, for example, for refueling and so forth. Or number three is the privilege of landing in another state to discharge passengers, cargo, or mail. Number four is the privilege of landing in another state to pick up passengers, cargo, or mail. And number five is the privilege of landing in another state to pick up or discharge passengers, cargo, or mail from a third state. So these are the five freedoms of the air according to the Chicago Convention of 1944. Now, when it comes to the question of jurisdiction over airspace, the general agreement is that the territorial state and the flag state enjoy concurrent jurisdiction. In other words, they both could claim jurisdiction over crimes that occur over the in the airspace of the territorial state. But please remember that according to international law, and we've covered this before, territory always trumps flag. And this is especially the case, the primacy of territory over flag, especially if the sovereign state decides to exert authority and exercise jurisdiction. Now, there are a couple of conventions that regulate the issue of jurisdiction and concurrent jurisdiction over airspace. The oldest one is the Warsaw Convention of 1929, which deals with issues of litigation, of liability, and compensation, and things of that nature. But the more important one for our purposes in this course is the Tokyo Convention of 1963, which deals with offenses against penal law, acts jeopardizing the safety of persons or property on board civilian aircraft while in flight. And this is where the question of flag state jurisdiction versus the piece of the port doctrine, which bring the territorial claims of jurisdiction to the fore, and this sometimes this friction between jurisdiction of the flag state versus the territorial state become interesting. So again, the general rule here is that the territorial state has the right, if and should it chose to exercise its jurisdiction. And normally, the circumstances where the territorial state will exercise its jurisdiction is where questions of peace of the port become an issue and become consequential. So the peace of the port doctrine essentially claims that the sovereign state may choose to refrain from asserting jurisdiction over foreign flag vessels and aircraft, leaving control of the matter to the flag state. So in these cases, jurisdiction is generally asserted over incidents that have consequences beyond the vessel or the aircraft and affect the peace and tranquility of the sovereign state. Again, if you look at the Article 4 of the convention, here you could see that it is specified that in normal circumstances, a territorial state may not interfere with an aircraft in flight unless the offense has some dimension that affects security or traffic rules. And the convention specifically establishes the authority of the aircraft commander to deal with offenses on board. So here you have a division of labor between the flag state and the territorial state, where the territorial state normally only asserts its jurisdiction where the peace of the port is jeopardized in some fashion. Next, we have one of the more interesting aspects of governance of airspace, which deals with issues of skyjacking or air piracy, which is defined as the forcible seizure of an aircraft. The motives for skyjacking could be political, symbolic, financial, or even asylum seeking. In terms of international legal mechanisms to deal with hijacking, we have two major mechanisms, the Hague Convention and the Montreal Convention. The Hague Convention of 1970 deals exclusively with civilian aircraft and establishes the principle of universal jurisdiction over issues of air piracy. And according to the Hague Convention of 1970, air hijacking becomes a separate crime, and the convention gives both the state of registration and the receiving state being the state where the aircraft may land, a grant of universal jurisdiction to prosecute a hijacker. The language of the convention excludes motivation from consideration, which was a loophole in the Tokyo Convention of 1963. So here, extradition becomes almost mandatory, and there is no room for discretion on what the motive was for air piracy, whether it was seeking asylum, it was symbolic, or it was it was to score some political points. Next, you have the so-called Sabotage Convention, also known as the Montreal Convention of 1971. This convention set out the principle that a party to the treaty, to the Montreal Convention, must either prosecute a person who commits hijacking or send the individual to another state that requests his or her extradition for prosecution. So here you have the complete criminalization of the safety of civil aviation threats. And the state should either try or extradite the perpetrator. Now, in terms of the friction between the law versus politics of anti-hijacking international law, one of the most well-known cases is the T. Druss case of 1978, which deals with the LOT Polish airline Flying 165 hijacking, where East German hijackers seek political asylum in West Germany, and then they're tried by a German jury that decides to apply German law in this never before convened in this novel case of United States Court of Berlin. And politics of the case kick in, where West Germany's policies of supporting the right of East Germans to fly to escape oppression in East Germany becomes into the play and becomes an issue. And finally, a relatively light verdict is handed down, where the sentence for hijackers is commuted to 9 months of time that's already been served. You also have a few unorthodox hijacking cases. The most famous, the most dramatic one is probably Operation Entebbe of 1976, where the Israeli Defense Forces essentially raid the airport in Uganda, and they free the passengers on board, and this happens without the consent of the Ugandan president Idi Amin, and then it rises and it gives rise a whole slew of questions on whether the raid in Entebbe constituted a violation of sovereignty. Next is the question of aircraft in distress. Remember that according to customary international law, it is generally recognized that an aircraft in distress has the right, to penetrate national airspace and to land on national territory. Again, remember, this is according to customary international law, and the situation that gives rise to distress could be either, I don't know, unfavorable weather conditions or things of that nature, generally speaking. And another international legal mechanism to deal with the governance of airspace is the Treaty on Open Skies of 1992. This is a post-Cold War treaty which establishes the notion of mutual aerial observation that is done by unarmed aerial surveillance aircraft over the entire territory of other member states. And this is one of the most wide-ranging international arms control regimes to promote transparency in enforcing those arms control treaties and mechanisms to make sure that no cheating is taking place. Next, you have the question of telecommunications and the wireless transmission into another state's airspace or even through another state's airspace. Here you have the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, which is tasked with global coordination of the radio spectrum, assignment of satellite orbits, telecommunication infrastructure in developing world, and worldwide technical standard setting. And the general accepted notion here is the principle of non-interference with the communications of contracting governments, and not jamming broadcasts from other contracting states. An interesting case here is the special case of Radio Marti, which revolves around the question of the right of a state, in this case the United States, to invade the airwaves of another state and whether the other state has the right to jam in self-defense, and whether the notion of invading the airspace or the airwaves of another state constitutes an illegal and an inadmissible act, especially if it is designed to foment internal subversion in another country. So that's an interesting case of whether this special case of Radio Marti actually interferes with the notion and with the principle of sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of another state, which is one of the established principles of international law. So next we have outer space, which, as I mentioned, is defined as that void space beyond that 100-kilometer vertical boundary, and defines the void space between celestial bodies. Here you have the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which establishes the demilitarization of outer space and a notion of CHM and CHM principle, which now is one of the established principles of international law, and freedom of exploration and use by all states of outer space, no claims of sovereignty through use or occupation or any other means over outer space exclusive, peaceful use of outer space, states' responsibility and liability for national space activities, and also avoiding harmful contamination of space and celestial bodies. Just remember that CHM principle I talked about, that refers to the notion of common heritage of mankind, and it's, like I said, it's now one of the by and large established and largely accepted principles of international law. And finally, you have the Moon Treaty of 1979, which recognizes the jurisdiction of the entire international community over all celestial bodies, and this includes the orbits around such bodies. So essentially here, no country could assert sovereignty over the moon, and the moon is recognized also as CHM, as common heritage of mankind, where all states have an equal right to conduct research on celestial bodies, and all resource extraction and allocation should be governed by an international regime. But remember that the Moon Treaty is largely a failed treaty, since it has not been either signed or ratified by any state that is seriously engaged in space exploration, and this would include countries like the United States, Russia, China, India, Japan, etc., none of whom have signed, or even if they have signed, they have not ratified the Moon Treaty.